Hello, I'm Catherine Gilliard, a Frances Ellen Watkins Harper Editorial Fellow at the 19th. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's conversation is a part of the Tulsa Project, an ongoing series of stories exploring the ripples, both past and the ones still living with us, resulting from the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, namely those of politics and power. In 1921, the community of Greenwood, also known as Black Wall Street, was devastated when a white mob burned, bombed, and brutally massacred its residents. While the massacre is undeniably a defining moment in Tulsa's history, the story doesn't end there. Victor Luckerson is a journalist, writer, and lover of Black history who's focused much of his work on the parts that have been neglected. In 2019, Luckerson moved to Tulsa to take on the history of Dreamland, and his book, Built from the Fire, is the result of the last 5 years of work. A part of that work has been chronicling the stories he's found exploring Greenwood's history to present in the book's accompanying newsletter, Run It Back. In the newsletter, Victor touches on what's become a through line in the series and storytelling of Greenwood, the importance of words, and the subsequent impacts of those in power, namely the media, weaponizing them. Join us for a conversation with him as we explore the role language plays in storytelling, the media, and how its ripples touch and reflect for us today. Hey, Victor, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing well, Catherine. Thanks so much for having me on this. I'm excited about our discussion.
I just want to start by saying congratulations for your book, Built from the Fire. How does it feel to have it in hand, have it out in the world, and to have this story out in the world?
Yeah, it's been very humbling in a lot of ways. I've been on a national tour for the last couple of weeks, which has been really cool. This is my very first book, so I've never really had the opportunity to interact with people who engage in my work so directly. You probably know as well as I do that in the digital age, it's a lot harder to make that kind of like authentic connection with your readers. So that's been really special. And it's been especially moving, I think, to have so many of the families captured in the book connecting with me. I actually spoke at the Smithsonian Institution last week, and there were descendants of the Goodwin family, Lula Williams, Mary Jones Parrish, A.J. Smitherman, all sort of chroniclers, writers, people involved in the media in some way, all those families. And so to have their descendants there at this event, both cheering me on, but also I think feeling some recognition for the fact that their families are sort of being captured and immortalized in this work. That was really special. So I think that's the most satisfying thing about it has been really seeing the families that I spent so long working with actually being able to hold the work in their own hands.
Speaking of the families, both the descendants and some of the survivors, Viola Fletcher, as you know, she's one of the survivors of the massacre. She's 109 years old, still living, and soon to be the oldest woman in the world, actually, to publish a memoir. I talked with Margot Ochoa, the publisher, for her book, and she spoke very earnestly about how, for her, this was a form of literary activism. Margot spoke about her challenges to getting people to say yes to things that had to do with Viola's story, as a lot of Black authors and stories do, and how its reception so far has affirmed the reason she came into the work and the importance of continuing to push for those stories. How does that make you feel? Does anything about that like resonate with you in your process or in your experience? And do you consider the work that you do to be literary activism in a way?
Yeah, I think that survivor accounts are the most precious thing we have. Going back to events of the Tulsa disaster written by race massacre survivor Mary Jones Parrish. If you think back to what life was like in Tulsa in the 1920s, the white press really was kind of trying to control the narrative of what unfolded in Greenwood. Trying to cast it as sort of this battle between low class blacks and low class whites, trying to say that Niggertown should never be rebuilt again. Really trying to advance this notion that this community really had no value. And it was really through survivor accounts that Mary Jones Parish collected that we came to understand that, in fact, people of all sort of like class groups have been involved in the attack, including police officers, members of the Home Guard, sort of like National Guard enclave in Tulsa. That airplanes were used to attack and surveil Greenwood, and that in Greenwood itself, people ranging from everyday folks to doctors were decimated by this attack. And so we wouldn't know any of that information without survivor accounts. And so to have, I think that book was actually published in 1923. So to have 100 years later another survivor account from somebody who remembers the race massacre and can sort of give us that urgency to understand that this wasn't ancient history. People are alive who still experienced it. I think that's extremely important. So really looking forward to reading Mother Fletcher's account. I got a chance to interview her for my book in 2021, and so I was really struck by her telling me that she still like struggles to sleep at night, in her bed with the lights off because it sort of recalls the experience she had on May 31st, 1921. And so that trauma doesn't go away over time, it lingers. My book kind of explores that with other figures who survived the massacre. And so it's really important that we have her account. To your second point about literary activism, that's a really interesting question. I came up in a very traditional journalism training. I went to the University of Alabama, was a journalism major. I was the editor of our school newspaper, and sort of in that mold. Activism is kind of a dirty word, like your job as a journalist is to be objective and removed from the situation. And so it's been really interesting for me to sort of I think I've both changed my approach somewhat, but I think I've also used that background to create a work that can engage a lot of different kinds of people. Like if you read my book, the account of the race massacre riot is fairly, I don't know if the right word is reserved exactly, but it's not. I'm not writing in a very melodramatic way about what happened. The facts themselves are brutal enough, you know what I mean? And so I think there is some value in taking the journalistic standards or tropes or methodology and then applying it in a way that clearly has maybe a more activist motivation. I think if you read my book, you understand my perspective and my intentions, but I'm also not sort of writing in like the traditional activist mode. And so I think I sort of am able to maybe create some kind of hybrid. And I think even the early feedback I've gotten from the book is that people really kind of appreciate being able to sit with those facts and those events and that horror and kind of interpret it for themselves, as opposed to me sort of saying to them again and again and again how horrible it was, what we need to do about it, because the facts themselves speak for the atrocity that was done to Tulsa, and the facts that are going on there today speak to the fact that justice has not been atoned for. And so I wouldn't quite call myself an activist, but I do think that I've incorporated more of that mindset than I did when I was sort of a traditional journalist in college learning the ropes.
When I started on the Tulsa Project, Run It Back, your newsletter was such a huge guide for me. One of the additions that stuck with me the most was 18, A Way with Words. It explores language, words, particularly those of the media and the role before, during, and after the massacre. Tell me about the string of observations you made that led to this entry and why you thought it was important to include this as a part of the newsletter.
Well, first off, Catherine, I gotta say I'm excited to hear you're a running back head. Like I have never had any sense of who was reading this newsletter or why I was writing it almost, because there's a lot of extra work to craft that newsletter every 2 weeks. But I'm glad that it was able to help you sort of wrap your head around what was happening in Tulsa at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so sort of why I wrote this one in particular, and like you said, it kind of digs into the role of the media in early Tulsa leading up to the race massacre. I remember that first of all, there's a lot of challenges in archival research in finding a wide diversity of accounts. It's pretty easy to dig up white newspaper accounts of whatever you want to find in early 1900s Oklahoma. But with black newspapers, let's just take the Tulsa Star as an example. The Tulsa Star was the black newspaper in Greenwood before the race massacre, but like half of the issues are missing. Whether that's because they were destroyed during the race massacre when the Tulsa Star plant was destroyed, whether it's just due to institutional neglect, no one thought they were important enough to preserve. I don't know the answer to that, but the fact is we don't have as much information from the black POV as we do from the white POV from that era. And when you dig into what the white POV was saying, one thing that really jumped out to me was this sometimes always a sort of allowing of lynching and sort of a condoning of it, and sometimes even a celebration of it. There was a lynching in a town called Wagner of a black woman named Marie Scott in the late 1910s. And I remember when I was reading through all the accounts of what had happened, it was in the white press in this town Wagner where they said, well, sometimes a lynching is warranted. They were sort of rationalizing the destruction of our court of law and our system of governance, basically. And it was only in the black press that I observed people actually saying, no, like lynchings are never appropriate. We need to actually go through due process for these citizens, no matter what they might be accused of. And it was so striking to me that actually the black press was espousing more universalist democratic ideals. Often they weren't even speaking on things in a racialized way. They were saying, every person, man or woman, black or white, deserves a trial, for example. Whereas in the white press, they're saying, let's throw out due process because we want to, get these Negroes more or less. And so I think that was when I really realized that, oh, like the rhetoric these papers are using is really sort of reinforcing, how the society should function. And I think in that era in particular, you got to think about the fact that these newspapers are the equivalent of today's like cable news networks, Facebook, Twitter, like these are the megaphones through which people are sort of interpreting the way the world should work, basically.
Mhm.
And so to see the white press essentially condoning and sometimes even celebrating lynching in contrast to the black press, illustrating how obviously wrong it is, was something that I really felt was digging into and really trying to understand, where this dichotomy is coming from and sort of how it's going to be part of the stepping stone that gets us to the massacre in 1921.
Hmm. Now I know you call me a running back here, so I just want you to know I ain't let number 18 go yet. Uh, so there are so many quotes that ring in my head from this piece because they're gems, but also because of how they mirror issues persisting today. You write about the missing editorial page in the Tulsa Tribune that housed the infamous "Nab Negro for attacking girl" in elevator article. In it, you say, "For me and my work, the missing editorial is a distraction. I'm not interested in explaining a point in time, but a system of discrimination that recurs across generations. There is no outlier fact that can suddenly explain the reasoning behind the Tulsa massacre because it was not an outlier event. It was the result of a culture that Tulsa and America at large had been cultivating over the course of generations." Whew. Uh, but can you speak to how this systemic racism and prejudice shows up now and how it's continued in journalism today? What does that say about the parallels of the country's culture in 1921 and now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in terms of how I sort of approach my research, if you read a lot of stuff about, if you start digging into the history of the race massacre, there's a lot of sort of tantalizing mysteries around it. Like Dick Rowland and Sarah Page had this encounter on the elevator. Kind of who are they and sort of what happened to them? No one quite knows. These articles that were published in the Tulsa Tribune that were removed from the newspaper. There is one article, a news article that said "Mad Nigger for attacking girl in elevator," that was literally ripped from the pages when the newspaper was later archived. And there was another editorial that said "To lynch a Negro tonight" that was allegedly written, but no one's ever been able to pinpoint it. And so a lot of times when people sort of engage with this analysis of Greenwood, it sort of almost has this true crime element where you're trying to figure out the quote unquote smoking gun that will prove what happened. You know what I mean? But when I started digging into it, I saw that actually this is like a pattern of discrimination and racial hatred that led to the racial violence. So it wasn't there's like one thing that's going to sort of prove or validate the theories around the race massacre. There's actually an enormous amount of evidence about what happened. And importantly, what happened in Tulsa was not isolated. There was racial violence happening across the United States, beginning around the time of the Red Summer of 1919 and on to the early 1920s. That really mirrored what was going on in Tulsa across the dynamics, more or less. And so it was really important to me when I crafted my book to make sure that people understood that this isn't a story about one bizarre, horrible thing that happened in America. This is the story of America. And so I really wanted to let people wrap their heads around that by not fixating on these very specific sort of strange mysteries that are tied up in the Tulsa story. Um, in terms of today, I mean, I think that one of the biggest parallels I see is the fear mongering that's involved in white media in Tulsa and Oklahoma in the early 1900s. This idea we're going to cast black people as the other, as criminals, as people who are somehow dangerous. And so, I see a lot of that when I think about the way that our history and the stories of both Black people and other marginalized groups are being demonized in this sort of backlash to quote unquote critical race theory. So I sort of see that same dynamic of creating an other category. Like first, let's have a lot of rhetoric that creates an other. And now that we've othered them in this rhetoric, we can do whatever we want to with more pernicious laws and that kind of thing. And so I think that's a big way in which the media is similar today. And then I also think a lot about the Capitol riots on January 6th. And so I think one very particular point I've thought about a lot on that is the fact that in both Tulsa in 1921 and immediately after the Capitol riots, there was this sort of knee-jerk reaction, sort of cast everyone who was involved as like a low-class person or like these are like sort of the white trash people. these are like separate from the good upstanding citizens of Tulsa or of, the United States. And in both cases, when you actually dig in, you find that, oh, if you look at photos of the race massacre, there's men in suits out there among the mob. There's men in National Guard uniforms or police uniforms out there. And similarly, after the Capitol riots, we found that many of those folks were like local politicians, businessmen, powerful folks in white communities across our country. And so I think those are kind of the parallels that I've seen in my few years of research, that where I've seen very similar dynamics playing out from back then 100 years ago, and the way the media ecosystem tries to shape narratives today.
Look, is that my doctor up there? Oh.
Right, exactly.
There's again the gems. There was a point you talk about the Red Summer and Mary Parrish's work. I was speaking with Annalise Bruner, but her work is, I think I think back to the gravity of that work and like how foundational it's been for all the further scholarship, but particularly the, like, yes, she went back and like buried witness and held space for these stories, but the risk to also go back and do that during that time, not too far removed from the Red Summer or the like environment that caused it and that was persisting. I was just speaking to the gravity of that. And okay, I'm still not done with number 18 because it's just that good job. But in closing newsletter in the 18th, it's the white account of what happened in Tulsa that still anchors our general understanding of the massacre, in part because the infrastructure to spread Black knowledge of the events was physically set aflame. The massacre was an attack on Black bodies, but it was also an attack on Black thought. It's the role of modern journalists and historians to sift through the records that remain so that a more diverse set of perspectives can get us closer to the truth. And we must always remember that the first draft of history, like any other kind of writing, had its own agenda. Can you speak more to the importance of this diversity, to the role that we as journalists with intersectional identities like our Blackness have and how it impacts truth? How should newsrooms prioritize the ability to tell the truth and how goals of objectivity impede that?
Yeah. That's, I think, again, when I wrote that, I was thinking a lot about AJ Smitherman. AJ Smitherman was the editor of the Tulsa Star before the race massacre. And he was really the person who was sort of articulating this vision against mob violence and lynch law through the prism of American idealism, and really a commitment to America's proposed values extremely well. And I was really struck by that, with this man who had born in Alabama in the Jim Crow South and ventured to Oklahoma and sort of was watching this huge backlash to Greenwood's progress, was framing his argument around the fact that no, y'all have created a set of values you state this country has, and I'm going to force you to live up to them. So I just found that really compelling, and I think in terms of what that sort of difference in what the accounts we have are, again, I go back to the idea that AJ Smitherman's newspaper was destroyed, and many of the issues are now missing or gone. And so we don't even have a full account of what AJ Smitherman thought. We only have bits and pieces from the issues that remain today. So to me, part of our job today is a few things. I think one is to have those different voices in the newsroom, because they're going to have different perspectives on how things are unfolding. The same way that AJ Smitherman and the white journalists had different perspectives on the lynching of the woman in Wagner in the 1910s. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And they're both sort of presented as a certain version of truth for their audiences. So we need to have all the different voices coming together to present different voices today. But I also think it's really important that journalists of color and Black journalists in particular are really given space to articulate the truth of their experiences and even sort of go live those truths. I remember when I worked at Time Magazine a few years ago, it was against the rules to go to the Eric Garner protest in New York. So it just wasn't allowed to go there and sort of have any kind of cathartic experience of that, or try to understand or comprehend what that was. You know what I mean? It wasn't even my place to even go be there and sort of understand the vibes of that community or what people were going through, because the brand would look bad theoretically if a Time Magazine reporter was out here at the protest. You know what I mean? And that just rang really hollow for me as a person who I don't know, went through a lot of psychological distress observing all these Black men being murdered at the early part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so to sort of not have a space to neither go to that protest or to hold space in our offices, I don't think that was an appropriate approach. And I think maybe in the last, especially after 2020, I think a lot of newsrooms had a little more of a direct reckoning with the way they were sort of articulating some of those policies. But obviously, I think there's still a ways to go. And sort of the last point I make on this topic is the fact that we still need to do a lot more effort to preserve those older Black voices. I think what Ms. Bruner's done, reviving Mary Jones Parrish's book is essential. That's such an essential book, and the fact that now it is in wide circulation for the first time ever is amazing. And so there's a lot of work to be done, not only among our younger generation of current or rising journalists, but also to recover the Black journalists who are doing this work for literally for centuries with not much attention given, not much care given, and not much careful archiving done in the past. A lot of that information, it's not too late to recover their work right now. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to do some of that. I think hopefully my book does a good job of recovering the legacy of the Oklahoma Eagle in particular in some ways. I come through that paper and its coverage of Greenwood over the course of decades. And I think having an organ of the Black press sort of anchored and honored in that way in this community is really important. But there's so much more that can be done in so many other communities with so many other voices. And so I hope that as sort of, there's a lot of interest in Black history these days. And I hope that as that continues to evolve, it's really anchored in the lived and grounded truth that these journalists were chronicling for centuries, as opposed to simply being spun into entertainment or titillation, or that kind of thing. So that's really that was a broad question. This is a broad answer, but hopefully I got a little progress there with you.
No, you did. How'd you say? More than just a trending topic.
Exactly.
So we're closing out here. So I just have two little-ish more questions for you. In your book, you spend it like covering Black history, of course, but also like following this family and following Black newspapers and talking about the women of Tulsa and like the giving all this context. And when I spent the week in Tulsa and in all the research I've done, like looking through reading through Run It Back, there's this through line of like this necessity to remember and how important it is. So I want to ask you, like, can you speak to that necessity of retelling and how does it connect us to our now? How important it is to be able to connect to our now?
Yeah, I mean, I think to bring running back into a little more, another one of my favorite articles I wrote for that newsletter was called What the White Folks Know. And I sort of happened upon a descendant of the white mob in my research. I was, again, that wasn't a priority for me. That would be for some people, but I was trying to write a very Black centered account of Greenwood. So I wasn't like going out trying to find the members, but I happened upon somebody in my research. And I was really kind of nervous about interviewing this guy. There was a grandson of a member of the mob and a great grandson. And the great grandson was sort of a person who had internalized what his family had participated in, and it made him sort of be wanting to be a more ardent ally of people of color. So I had that perspective in the article I wrote. And then his father was really interesting to me because I'd really expected that anyone who descended from that attack would carry it really deeply in some way, whether as his son had was sort of being horrified by it and saying he's going to be a stronger ally, or to be proud of it and to have this sort of dark history they shared as sort of a talisman of their hate. But his father was sort of more like, well, it's a bad thing that happened, but it's history. It is what it is. I don't personally feel much shame about it or guilt. I'm sorry it happened, but it's not my problem, was kind of the vibe of our interview. And it's not like he was some kind of like, artist, open-faced racist or something like that. He was just sort of a person who had said, this history is separate from my experience, so I don't really need to think about it too deeply, basically. And that was just really kind of threw me for a loop because I had never really thought about history. I didn't know people could think of history that way. I didn't know people could have history feel that distant from their own experience, because I think Black people don't feel that way. I think even if you're not a history buff, if you're a Black person, it's still this puzzle you haven't quite worked out, like where's your name from? Where are your people from? We're all sort of dealing with these histories that we don't quite understand. And so I think that was a huge eye-opening moment for me about how different types of Americans see the past. You know what I mean? And again, that to me, that's different than the sort of like anti-CRT erase history dynamic that's going on. I think there's another interpretation of it that might be more common among quote unquote regular Americans, where it's just not that important to them. But when I look at history, I think what I see is that I see myself in the history, and that's why it's resonant for me. You know what I mean? Like I see myself in the Goodwin family, who I sort of follow in the book, and their sort of internal family dynamics and the different strategies they use sort of climb into the Black middle class. Some of those things my family experienced the same way. You know what I mean? And I sort of see my history when I think about how the highway destroyed Greenwood, but also destroyed the Black community in Montgomery, where I'm from. You know what I mean? And so for me, it's just all these patterns I'm seeing that reflect my own experience and my community's experience. And I know I had an event in Atlanta actually just 2 days ago with some panelists who are from Atlanta. And they were saying they saw the same thing. They saw their family, they saw their community in Greenwood and the good ones and everything like that. And so, I think that's, to me, that's the power history has. And I think that more people should open their eyes to that we're not, everything we're doing is not completely original here. In some ways we're retracing patterns of the past in American society, and sometimes that can be a good thing. You're inspired by the achievements of Greenwood, the resilience of that community. Sometimes it can be a bad thing when you see the January 6th riots and remind you of the Tulsa race massacre. And so I guess I would just leave folks just understand that history actually is important. Besides, it's not just trivia and it's not just entertainment. It's literally like a blueprint for where our society is right now and what we can do to go on a righteous path or a dark path. We always have that choice, and history kind of gives us a guide to that.
Oh, we gonna talk after. But I know you said you were closing out with that, but I did want to give you the space to, if you want to say anything else about this work, then this is the very last thing, I promise, about your work or this conversation that we didn't get a chance to touch on.
I guess I'll just mention Run It Back. We've talked about it a lot, but I have a newsletter where I sort of write through how I'm thinking through my approach to research. So you kind of get, like I said, my actual writing in the book is, I don't know the word for it, but it's not as plaintive as we're discussing right now, but you kind of get to see how my gears work before I sort of put in the quote unquote authoritative voice in the book.
Mhm.
And anyway, the newsletter is at runitback.substack.com. And so that's a great way to follow me in my work and get a little bit more of an inside scoop on how I think.
Thank you so much, Victor, for your time today, your labor into this work, for being a part of the series and sharing the story with us. It means the world to me. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. And definitely go to the 19thnews.org to check out more about Tulsa and our journalism. Keep safe out there.